Thanks for the invite. Thanks for allowing me to be here, and guests, thanks for tuning in because without you, we don't have an opportunity to share our time together and the lovely experiences that we've had in life. So let's just start there. For me, it comes down to the simple answer that I really want to go upstream. Everything about my world of medicine is trying to figure out how we got here in the first place and how to unwind it so that we don't need medicines. And so when I look at kids, I don't shun medicine ever, but I don't want to use medicine if I don't have to because medicines have side effects and risks associated with them. And so understanding labs is part of really truly being able to then say, okay, here's maybe where something went sideways, and here's maybe how we can get involved in a change of what's happening upstream so that we can make better decisions. So in pediatrics, it really came down to the fundamentals of just jumping in the deep end of the water and just saying, okay, what do we got? What do we know? And then this comes into the big discussion around conventional medicine is sort of this binary reality of, hey, this lab is normal and this lab is abnormal. And then if it's in the normal range, you're good to go. Well, functional medicine has proven very clearly that's not true. And so is science and study. So for me, this is a great opportunity to sit back and go, okay, let's share the knowledge that we've learned that helped us understand and navigate the world through a lens that's very different, i.e., it is a broader lens that allows us to say, hey, there's more opportunity here to lean on some levers of health and lifestyle before we end up in a diseased state, dysregulated immunology or whatever we have it that leads to disease down the road. And we're going to talk a little bit today specifically about cardiovascular disease, just to give a primer to one of the 6 weeks that we're going to do and help everyone understand why, because why is huge. Hey, Erik.
Well, good morning. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties, but now I jumped through the hoops and got in the webinar this morning. So
it's the theme of the week. We got a little bit of support actually from other folks saying they've been having tech issues too. We were chatting about, why this boot camp, why this topic.
yeah.
And I think there's nobody actually better poised to answer this question than you are with your internal family medicine practice. You're teaching a lot of docs who are from a more conventional setting. How do they use a functional medicine lens when they're looking at their lab work? What are they maybe not used to considering? What's the extra biomarker they might want to add to a panel? Can you talk to us a little bit about why this boot camp, why now? And then we're going to dive into some of the cardiovascular biomarkers we're going to be chatting through and how folks can have some clinical takeaways today.
I think that's such an interesting question because we go through medical school and we are all excited to start taking care of patients. And we have these tools, right? We can send them to the lab and understand kind of what's going on from a metabolic standpoint. But as I think back on my medical education, I was really trained to look at labs as a way of identifying problems so that I could provide a solution. Not actually thinking about what's going on with the individual and what the physiology is, the metabolic dysfunction. And no, I was taught to have these specific ranges to look at, find the problem, and then I have a solution for that problem that often has to do with pharmacological interventions. And it was actually very dissatisfying as a provider to be able to not have all of the information I felt like I needed or wanted to care for the patient in front of me, right? The person comes in and I order some labs and let's say they have a hemoglobin A1C of 5.8%. Well, what's my solution for that? Well, I don't have a drug I can give them. So I say, okay, well, do better on your diet and exercise more, right? I mean, it's not a satisfying solution to the problem. And so I think what I'm really excited about sharing, what I've seen, I mean, I just had a family medicine resident in our office yesterday, and he was just, his eyes were as big as saucers because he was like, wow, I've never thought about interpreting labs like this. I didn't understand that there was more meaning behind this than just trying to find the cutoff so that I could identify the problem and get the solution. And so that's what I'm excited about. I think that's why this course is so beneficial and necessary, and why I'm so excited to teach it, because it opens our minds to seeing the individual as a person, as a functioning biological unit, and then we're trying to look at where on that spectrum they are from disease to health and intervene early with lots of different solutions, not just a pharmacological solution. In doing so, we get people back into an optimal state of health. We're reversing the disease process instead of mitigating it by using drugs, right? I mean, the other thing that was interesting, we had a pharmaceutical rep. We still have those that come by occasionally to our practice. And I'm having a conversation with him, and he's trying to tell me about, and I'm like, you know what? Your drug actually doesn't apply because your drug is for extreme cases of type 2 diabetes who have hypercortisolism. When I asked him what's the underlying cause of this hypercortisolism, he couldn't answer me the question. He says, no, you just need to look for this criteria and then you can use the drug. And I'm like, but I want to know why. Why are a third of these patients having adrenal tumors? Like, that's weird to me, right? And I told him, I said, it's interesting because these patients, I wish we saw more of these type 2 diabetes and more cardiovascular patients in our clinic. But what happens is they get a solution that is a mitigating response. So we're decreasing the numbers. So the labs look better, right? That endpoint has now backed up a little bit, but we're not really solving any of the problem, right? The underlying problem that got them there. So the patient thinks, I'm okay. There's nothing wrong with me because now my A1C is less than 6.5%. I've got my LDL cholesterol down below 100 or down below 70. So now I'm good. I don't have to change anything. I'm being taken care of. But the dose of the medication is super high. There's consequences for that from a metabolic standpoint. Anyways, you now have the framework that I work within and think about when I'm looking at these patients and when I'm teaching residents and other colleagues.
I think it's beautiful. And one of the things I love that you guys are going to go through is like ICD-10 codes, because I think a lot of us think, well, how would I even get some of this stuff covered, right? Or am I going to get it covered for my client if I do this more root cause investigative work where I'm looking at a level that's not optimal? I know I need to dig deeper to find the underlying root cause of dysfunction. You guys are going to chat about that each week, and we can talk through that a little bit today. I want to give people a little bit of a preview and chat through a bit of why you guys have a special lipid panel, a special approach to checking values that we consider to be involved in cardiovascular risk. And so I'm going to share my screen and let you guys kind of chat through just an example of how you tend to think about this through a functional medicine approach. And Chris, if you want to kick us off, let me hand it over to you.
Yeah, so two things that I want to point out. One is the beauty of the way we're doing this is a dual approach with two different providers looking at it from two different lenses. Right. So when we think about medicine, I'm looking at it from the pediatric perspective. Erik's looking at it from the whole family perspective. And those are two different lenses that are both beautiful. And I think the listeners, you're going to have an opportunity to see two different ways of skinning the cat. And that's a good thing, because in medicine, if I've learned anything in the last 30 years, is that we're completely and continuously evolving the data that we have and the knowledge that we have. And some people are better at studying certain things than others, and that shared knowledge is incredibly powerful. So, Erik, I want to have you start. Describe in a very quick synopsis, what is atherosclerosis? Because we're going to get a deep dive into this in one of the modules early on, and we're going to really get into the why. So dive into the what is it? What is the ASCVD?
Yeah, so before I go there, I also want to give the audience a little more perspective on Chris, because he's too humble to actually talk. He has an amazing immunological background as well. So not only does he look at this from the standpoint of how can I optimize the health of the child, but he actually backs it up and say, I want to know, like, from the womb perspective. So I'm looking at the mother and what I can do to try and help the mother and improving the actual development of the child in the womb and then come out. So I just want to give you that perspective. And then he has an amazing immunological background and the way that he approaches things. And you'll see in a lot of what we're doing, particularly in cholesterol and in the development of atherosclerosis, that immunology plays a huge role in the development of this disease. So I just wanted to clarify that you're not just getting a pediatrician on here. You're getting a scientist and an immunologist, as well as somebody who thinks about this very critically and deeply. Atherosclerosis really fundamentally, its root causes has three primary problems, right? It's immune dysfunction, inflammation, and oxidative stress. And so when we're looking at a cholesterol profile, we want to identify, see if we can pick up on some evidence that there are changes in inflammation, changes in the immune function, and then changes in oxidative stress. And we'll talk about that. But essentially what we're seeing is the development of these rusty fats, or these oxidized LDL particles, that become very triggering for the body. The immune system immediately identifies them and wants to go after them and start to clear them out. And one of the ways that it does that is sends macrophages to gobble them up. And then all these excess triglycerides that then are usually accompanying these rusty fats get brought into this macrophage, and you get what we know as a foam cell, and these combinations of these foam cells build up and they start to form plaque and increase the burden of the blood vessel circulation process. And then just from an inflammation standpoint, you get a lot more white blood cells. You're getting triggering an activation of the clotting process. Fibrin and fibrinogen respond to inflammatory signals from the immune system. And so as that's upregulated and they get more triggered, they're more clot happy. And we start seeing a lot of microclotting first, and then we start to see bigger clots. And the body then, in an effort to try and compensate for that, will bring in calcium and try and basically cement over some of these soft plaques to make them less unstable, to stabilize them. And so that then starts to narrow the lumen of the blood vessel wall and increases the blood pressure, because now you're pushing through a smaller lumen to get the blood places, and that drives things up. And then from the standpoint of oxidative stress and how the mitochondria, nitrous oxide is what is the primary currency in endothelial function in terms of the dilation and constriction of the blood vessel wall. And nitrous oxide can start to get impaired pretty significantly, and we start getting peroxides as a byproduct instead of nitrous oxide, and that further damages the endothelial wall. And then we get into the endothelial glycocalyx, which is basically the repair mechanism of the endothelial wall, and it starts getting damaged. I think of that as kind of a coral reef. And the coral reef gets damaged. It doesn't have these glycoproteins like heparin sulfate and other things to help repair the damaged endothelium. And that's what we call the aging process. So I know I kind of jumped in a little deep on some of those areas, but that's kind of the overall scheme of what happens. So all that we're looking at is to try and prevent, reverse, slow down that metabolic dysfunction that's happening in the vascular system.
Let me jump in and say, like, beyond the average lipid profile, which most docs are used to ordering, as we talk about like that whole, because some of us, we sit in these lectures, right, and we hear about all this physiology, and we're like, oh, the oxidative stress and the immune system, but we don't know what to order to start to think about that. So you guys have a whole list of biomarkers that you go through in the boot camp. But as we think about even what you just said, Dr. Lundquist, what are some of the biomarkers beyond total cholesterol, triglycerides, LDL, HDL that come to mind that people are missing that should get added when you want to look at that whole cycle for someone? I
immediately think of high sensitive CRP. And there's a difference between C-reactive protein and either some LabCorp calls it cardiac CRP. Quest uses high sensitive CRP. And the difference between that is the protein makeup, so that they can identify this is more related to cardiovascular system versus just the overall immune response in the body. So a high sensitive C-reactive protein is one. Lipoprotein phospholipase A2 or LPPLA2 is another one I look at, because it is an enzyme that's released in the process of plaque buildup. So as the body is making more plaque in the vascular system, it upregulates this enzyme, phospholipase A2. That is then a signal that, okay, the plaque process is being increased. So looking at that as a marker. And then myeloperoxidase is another one that we can look at that's readily available at both labs that gives us a sense of the oxidative stress burden. It's another enzyme that's often upregulated and released by macrophages as they're trying to accommodate and downregulate some of the inflammation and the oxidative stress that's happening, the burden that's happening in the damage that's happening in the blood vessel wall. So those are three that come to mind. I don't want to steal all the thunder. I'll let Chris jump in there and share a few of his thoughts on this.
You know, there's a lot of other ones we can look at. I mean, it's sort of getting fascinating when we think about the world of ApoB, and we'll get into that a little bit in a slide coming up, but just using ApoB as a proxy marker metric. And I think one of the things that needs to be hammered home is whatever you're choosing are metrics to look at, make sure you use the same lab consistently. because one of the problems that people get into is if they're using, let's say, LDL particle number, and you're getting it from different labs, that disparate lab may have different outcome. No delay as a singular test looking at increased atherogenic risk. Those are sort of important things that we'll get into in a deep dive actually in the course. When we think about lipidology, which is what I like to sort of call this, I like to explain this in simple terms, right? These are basically these things called lipoproteins. And there's a fancy way I use the determination of they're cars and buses. And so you think about you eat a bunch of food and in there you make fats and they're absorbed. Well, they want to be absorbed by these big massive molecules called chylomicrons and very dense lipoprotein. And those things are filled with triglyceride and they also have cholesterol in them. And those cars then decrease in size, appear. And that is where the cardiovascular literature has went over the past years that they're looking at, and we'll show this in the course, is that as you go up in particle number and they get smaller and dense, these LDLs that are oxidized, those are the damaging atherogenic particles. And so we're going to want to understand the why. And this is the big piece of this, because I spend a lot of time teaching kids why they should change their diet, why they should make different choices around exercise because of the cardiovascular risk over time. And it's really, truly understanding what these particles, what these cars are doing by carrying around the fats and the cholesterol and how they're dumping them off in different locations. But what gets super fascinating is now this whole world where we spent a lot of time for my period of time at Emory and medical school where we were told good and bad cholesterol. And I want to say right out of the gate, let's get rid of the words good and bad. Those are useless terms. They mean nothing. There is no such thing as good or bad inside the body. There is unbalanced and balanced. And that's sort of the way I look at this stuff. And so cholesterol in and of itself is a very important molecule that we'll talk about again in the course that has very incredible, powerful properties inside the body, whether in cell membranes, whether it's forming steroid hormones, or it's doing a bunch of other stuff. But cholesterol in and of itself is a great thing. It's not a bad thing at all. But where it becomes dysregulated is the huge problem. And that's where we have too many of these lipoproteins floating around because they're having to carry more lipids or triglycerides. And, oh, by the way, they're involved in innate immunity, right? As Erik said, my huge passion is anthropologic history and immunity. And it turns out HDL and LDL are part of our innate immune system. And the next slide sort of goes through this understanding of oh, by the way, we could understand these things when we looked at damage based on genetics. So if you have certain risk factors like an ApoE4 genotype or a PCSK9 mutation, it was thought to be during the past, we'll go through in the discussion, but these mutations, these relevant elevations in triglycerides and LDL particles and all these things we talk about that are bad now are only bad in the context of the world we live in now. They're not bad. They were never bad. For most of human history, they're fantastic. And so we're going to demystify these stories that I think really make people misunderstand what really is going on inside the body. So this is going to help us understand inflammation, dysbiosis, and really go deep into the why we need to test. And if we are testing, what we need to do about that. So I hope that sort of lays the framework for what we're going to get into in the cardiovascular lab test, but that's the big piece of this.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.